Welcome in to the Rock Talk Studio, where rock and roll books and documentaries are reviewed, previewed, and most importantly, recommended. So if you're looking for a good new rock and roll book or documentary to check out, here comes the good stuff. Like today's book, the most anticipated rock and roll book of 2024 is out. No need to tease it. Today, it's all about the new Alex Van Halen book, Brothers. I'm your host, Big Rick. Join me for an exclusive look into what's hitting the shelves and the screens, and get ready to rock your reading and viewing list. To say I was shocked when Alex Van Halen announced that he was writing a memoir would be an understatement, and I think that goes for a lot of people. There was no warning, no build up to the news. It was just announced that Alex Van Halen is releasing his memoir, and not only a memoir, but a book about his brother. Eddie passed just a couple of years before Alex started writing this book, so it took a lot of people by surprise that Alex, who wasn't the most vocal of guys, was writing a book called Brothers. This is really Alex's first extended comments about the passing of his brother, and his grief embodies most of the pages. He is obviously still mourning Eddie, and he doesn't shy away from that in the book. And that openness and the bond that these brothers shared is really what makes this story a must-read. Alex tells the story of his family coming to America without being able to speak fluent English. And though most Van Halen fans know this story, he puts his family's struggles, challenges, and commitment to each other into context. His father, who plays a big part in this book, almost to the last few words in the book, was a musician and a taskmaster. He was also a heavy drinker. All three of these traits he passed down to his sons. And throughout the book, Alex shares how important his father's teachings were to him and Ed. Even though a lot of those lessons were rough and fueled with booze and anger, they stuck with the Van Halen brothers and became their code. Their success was overwhelming. Sometimes you forget that, and being able to see it from Alex's view, you get how challenging it was to handle that, especially for Ed. Alex does his best to explain what it was like for his brother to be looked at as a guitar god, and how the fame was difficult for Ed to understand. Ed was sensitive, and this is a word that Alex uses on multiple occasions. Sensitive. He uses the word like a big brother would use towards his little brother, not with judgment, but with love. It's really sweet. And that's one of the reasons this book is so special. It's Alex really struggling, grieving right there in the pages as he is trying to come to grips with the passing of his younger brother. Alex humanizes Ed in a way only a brother could. He doesn't hesitate to show how deeply talented and flawed he was. They both realized that Ed had an incredible gift early on, and that it was a blessing as much as a burden. He talks how he and Ed dealt with being rock stars, and at first it was a nostalgic attachment, but as the story grew, so did the loss of the purity of those early years. One of the biggest things that caught me off guard with this book was all the quotes used from other books and people. Alex actually used it to tell a fairly good chunk of this story. There were quotes from other Van Halen authors, namely former manager Noel Monk, Steve Rosen's in there, Ted Templeman, the producer. There's a lot of quotes from his book, and David Lee Roth are all featured prominently. But his most frequent speaker is his late brother, whose words Alex uses often throughout the book, taking quotes from interviews Ed did throughout the years. Did I mention David Lee Roth? Okay, let's talk Roth. First of all, this book only covers up until Roth left the band after the 1984 album. Secondly, Roth gets a lot of pub in these pages. Alex praises Dave a bunch, but he also doesn't shy away from how exhausting it was to deal with Dave's ego. At first, it was something that was needed because Alex and Eddie's desire to let the music just be the thing, let the music do the talking. Dave was out front doing the interviews, and unfortunately all the other primping and prancing that they really weren't into, but it helped the band get noticed. Alex points out in the beginning, the work ethic that propelled Van Halen had a lot to do with David Lee Roth. He gives him a lot of credit in this book and shares that Dave was actually the first person he called after Eddie passed. You get a good sense of how the back and forth with Roth was something there from the beginning and something that Alex agrees was a big part of their success. Alex lovingly remembers life with Ed. He is older now, and looking back at his life and all the times he shared with his baby brother, he recounts how music became their shared language and how their bond was all that mattered. The intimate writing from someone who shares a lot of his more unpleasant sides give this book a depth that can only come from a story about a big brother and a little brother. And Alex isn't shy with saying this was a love letter to Ed, which is true, but it's also a blessing and gift to all the fans who want to hear the story directly from the remaining Van Halen brother. Alex Van Halen Brothers is 240 pages, and it leaves you with a lot of questions. So now it's time for the one big question, the part of the show where I ask, what question did I feel this book needs to address? And man, if that wasn't a softball question, I don't know what was. We all know what this book didn't address. Van Halen has way too much messy history not to get into all those juicy details. What about Sammy? What about Mike? Gary Sharon? Wolfie? What about the times Dave came back and forth in the band? It goes on and on. And I'm going to answer the question about why this book didn't get into that coming up next. Before we get into this week's one big question, I've got to tell you about this new Rush book. It's called Rush at 50, and I'm giving it away. You can win this Rush book. It's a beautifully produced photo-packed celebration of Rush. Rush at 50 examines the history of the Canadian rockers through the lens of 50 milestone events and an illustrated gatefold timeline. It's a really nice-looking book. It's a unique look at Rush's career arc, from Toronto bar band to international mega platinum stadium fillers. Every page is illustrated with stunning concert and candid offstage photography, including gig posters, 7-inch picture sleeves, ticket stubs, and so much more. I promise you this thing is sweet. And all you've got to do to enter to win is send me an email. And that email is info@rocktalkstudio.com. That's info@rocktalkstudio.com to win this new Rush book, Rush at 50. Okay, let's jump into it. Is this Alex Van Halen book, Brothers, too short? Let's start there. The book is 240 pages, and to me, that is short. I read the book in less than 2 days. It's a quick read, but is it short with what it covers? Remember, this book only tells the story of Van Halen up until David Lee Roth leaves after the 1984 album and tour. No Sammy? Well, Alex briefly mentions him. What about the issues with Mikey? Alex briefly mentions Mike Anthony. And all the back and forth with Dave over the years, Wolfie joined the band. You're not going to get any of that. This book is only about the beginning chapters of Van Halen, and I am completely fine with it. Alex even says in the book that Van Halen was never the same after David Lee Roth left. As a piece of work, as a book, just telling this story up until this time creates an ending that allows for the focus to be more on who Alex wanted it to be on, and that's his brother. It's an amazing story of these brothers and what they overcame and how they stuck together to create rock and roll history. And I think that's enough. Now, do I want to hear about all the other stuff? Yes, absolutely. I think most do. I love rock and roll history. I love filling in all those missing pieces in my ever-expanding rock and roll knowledge. But Alex wrote this book right after Ed died, and these 240 pages create a beautiful tribute to the legacy of one of the greatest guitarists of all time. If you've been listening to the show for a while, First of all, thank you. I really appreciate it. If you've been listening, you know that I like to do shout outs to other rock and roll podcasts. To turn you on is something that I think is really cool in the world of rock and roll. Well, this week I want to do something a little bit different, but it's definitely in the world of rock and roll. And I want to tell you about the mother of all rock and roll newsletters, and that is the Zappagram. The Zappagram is put together by Chris Zappa, and Chris does a great job with creating a go-to source for the latest in so many different avenues in rock and roll. You've got music news, album reviews, artist interviews, new music releases, vinyl reissues, upcoming releases, new music discovery, music history, and so much more. There's so much packed into this newsletter, and that's what I like about this newsletter. It covers a lot of ground without bogging down with long-winded information dumps. It's one of my favorite music newsletters. If you're into newsletters, check this one out, the Zappagram. All right, coming up in next week's podcast, a rock and roll holy grail has been found. It was presumed lost, but it's been located by the author's wife. After the author, a famed lyricist and musician, passed away, this book documents the beginning of one of the greatest bands of all time. Here comes your hint: China Cat, Sunflower. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Love talking rock and roll and being able to give you the scoop on a title I think is worth your time and money. If you liked Alex's memoir, I'm going to point you to the archives, the 40-plus episodes that feature a bunch of memoirs you can still listen to for free. I highly recommend the Geddy Lee memoir. Lucinda Williams' memoir is very sincere and special. Robin Hitchcock's memoir is the most unique memoir of them all. There's a few others in there. Check out the archives for more great recommendations. All right, tear it down, pack it up, and head on down the road. We'll see you next time in the Rock Talk studio.